This has to be a mistake. She has never run anything in her life.
It is not a mistake, what he was doing.
Then he lost his mind at the end. The document is legally sound.
In 1998, a man walked into a room like this for the last time. He looked around at the people sitting at that table. The people who had helped him negotiate the deals that built his empire. The people who had shaken his hand when there was nothing to shake hands over. The people who had watched him go from a fabrication shop with 11 employees to a company that employed thousands. He looked at all of them, and he told them nothing about what he was planning. Because what he was planning, they would never have understood. Not the board members who had sat in those chairs for a decade. Not the attorneys who had advised him for 20 years. Not his 2 sons who had given their careers to the company their father built and had spent the last several years quietly calculating who would be standing when the time came. None of them were going to understand it, which is exactly why he hadn't told them. The lawyers read the will on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, the phones were ringing off the hook. By Friday, people were openly laughing. They laughed at the attorneys. They laughed at the board. They laughed at the idea that any of this could possibly stand. The word that kept appearing in those conversations, in those parking lot phone calls, and those hushed dinner table exchanges, and those closed-door meetings at the club, was mistake. Arthur Voss had made a mistake. A sentimental, emotional, end-of-life mistake. The kind of mistake that happened to brilliant men when age and illness got inside their judgment and rearranged the furniture. That was the consensus. That was the story. 20 years later, not one of them was laughing anymore. Here is what you need to understand about Arthur Voss before we go any further. This was not a man who made mistakes. Not in 40 years of business. Not once. He built Voss Industrial from a single regional manufacturing contract into a company worth $900 million. He did it without a famous name behind him, without family money, without the kind of connections that open doors before you even knock. He built it the slow way, deal by deal, relationship by relationship, decision by decision, and every single one of those decisions was made with the same cold, clear precision. He was the kind of man who, when presented with a contract, read every line of it himself before he let the attorneys read it. He was the kind of man who knew his operating costs down to the 4th decimal point. He was the kind of man who had fired 2 CFOs in a single decade, not for dishonesty, but for imprecision, for rounding when they should have been exact, for assuming things would balance out rather than making sure they did. His employees respected him. A smaller number of them liked him. An even smaller number understood what was actually happening behind those deep-set eyes at any given moment. Arthur Voss did not show you what he was thinking. He showed you what he had decided. And by the time you saw the decision, it was already made. So when Arthur Voss died and his will was read, and it turned out he had bypassed his 2 sons who had given their careers to that company, bypassed the board of directors who had helped steer it, bypassed his wife of 38 years, and left the controlling stake to someone that almost no one in that room had taken seriously. The question was not whether he had made a mistake. The question was, what did he see that nobody else did? Pause. Who was Eleanor Voss? Why did Arthur choose her above every other person in his life? What happened in those 20 years? What were the moves, the counter-moves, the things that happened in rooms that were never supposed to be on record? And where did every single person in that story end up when it was all over? Stay with me, because this story does not go the way you think it does. Arthur Voss was born in 1931 in the south side of Pittsburgh. His father worked the furnaces at a steel mill for 31 years and died at 54 without ever owning the house he lived in. Arthur watched that. He absorbed it. And he decided before he was old enough to shave that he was going to build something that nobody could take away from him. He started small. A machining apprenticeship at 17. A business certificate at night school, 3 nights a week, after 12-hour shifts, for 4 years. He did not talk about this period of his life much. What he said, in one of the few recorded interviews he ever gave, was simply, "I wanted to know how things worked. All of it. The machines and the money." A small fabrication contract at 29, which he ran out of a rented warehouse with 3 employees and 1 client. By 32, he had 11 employees and 4 clients. He had not yet moved out of the apartment he had lived in since he was 23. Every dollar the business generated went back into the business. His employees were paid first. Arthur Voss was paid last, and for several years, barely. By the time he was 45, Voss Industrial had over 2,000 employees, contracts with some of the largest manufacturers in the country, and a reputation in the industry for being the kind of company that delivered on time, every time, no exceptions. The reputation was Arthur's doing. He had built it by personally taking the calls when something went wrong, not his operations manager, not his VP of client relations. Arthur, at 2 in the morning if necessary. His direct line was on every major contract. He picked up. He was not a warm man. People who worked with him for decades would describe him as fair, exacting, and almost impossible to read. He did not celebrate. He did not congratulate easily. What he did was pay attention to everything, all the time. His assistant Ruth Ellison, who worked for him for 14 years, said that she never once saw Arthur Voss surprised by a piece of information. He always seemed to have already known it was coming. He married Patricia Hale in 1963. She was the daughter of a Pittsburgh banker, a connection that helped open certain doors in the early years, though Arthur was not the kind of man to lean on a door being opened for him. He walked through it and immediately started building something better on the other side. Patricia was warm where Arthur was cool, social where Arthur was reserved, and she compensated for his edges in rooms where edges were a liability. They were, in the way of certain long marriages, deeply different people who had built something together that neither could have built alone. They had 3 children. Derek came first in 1965, then Richard in 1967, and then Eleanor in 1971, 8 years after Patricia had assumed her family was complete. Eleanor's arrival was unplanned. That is not a secret the family kept particularly well, and from the very beginning, she occupied a different space in the family than her brothers did. Derek and Richard were groomed openly. They were taken to the office, introduced at industry dinners, brought along to plant visits from the time they were barely teenagers. They were told, in the subtle cumulative way that fathers tell sons things without actually saying them, "This will be yours. Be ready." Eleanor was not excluded exactly. She was simply not included. Except by Arthur. Arthur Voss had a habit that his assistant Ruth described many times in the years after he died. On Saturday mornings, when the office was empty and quiet, when there were no clients, no staff, no performance to give, he would bring a child with him to the office. In the early years it was Derek, then Richard. The boys would sit with him for an hour, grow restless, and end up in the conference room playing with the chairs or using the copier to print nonsense. Arthur would eventually call a driver to take them home. But from the time Eleanor was about 8 years old, it was almost always Eleanor on those Saturday mornings. She would sit in the corner of his office in an oversized leather chair that was far too big for her, feet not reaching the floor, the seat nearly swallowing her, and she would read. Not children's books, whatever was on his desk, annual reports, vendor contracts, industry trade publications. She did not always understand what she was reading, but she read it anyway, and she read it like it mattered, which was something Arthur noticed from the very first time he watched her do it. And sometimes, Arthur would look up from his own work and ask her what she thought. He never asked Derek or Richard that question in the office. He never had to. They volunteered their opinions constantly, loudly, and with complete confidence. They told him what he should do and what the company should be and where the money should go, and they said it with the certainty of people who have not yet learned what certainty costs. Eleanor answered differently. She would look at whatever she had been reading for a long moment, and then she would say something like, "I am not sure, but I think this number here does not match this number here. And that seems like it should matter." It always mattered. He never told her what he was thinking. He never told her she was special or that he was watching her with something other than the mild attention a father gives the youngest child sitting quietly in the corner. But Ruth, who witnessed those Saturday mornings from the hallway more than once over the years, said later that the look on Arthur's face when he listened to Eleanor's answer was different from any other look she ever saw on him. It was not pride, exactly. It was more like recognition. Like he had been looking for something for a long time, and he had just confirmed it was there. Now, his sons. Derek Voss was everything that a company like Voss Industrial was supposed to produce. He was tall, confident, well-dressed, and exceptionally good at making people feel like they were the most important person in the room. He had his father's name and his mother's social ease, and he had leveraged both of them into a career at Voss Industrial that looked, from the outside, enormously successful. He ran the company's largest sales division for 12 years. He cultivated relationships. He closed deals. He took clients to games and dinners and golf courses, and he was genuinely excellent at the human mechanics of those settings, the handshake, the room, the conversation that turned into a contract. What he was less good at was the part that came after. The operational follow-through. The numbers. The discipline of actually delivering against the promises that had been made over that dinner. Derek knew this about himself, at some level, which is why he had spent 20 years making sure he was surrounded by people who were good at those things. It is not a bad strategy. Many successful executives are built exactly this way, but it is a strategy that works only as long as you have the authority to keep choosing who is around you. The moment someone else controls that, the moment someone else decides who is in the room, the whole structure becomes fragile. Derek had never considered what happened if someone else controlled the room. Richard was closer to what his father actually was. Richard was sharp, patient, and strategic in a way that his brother was not, and he had spent his career at Voss Industrial building something that is harder to see than a sales record but more durable. He had made himself indispensable. He understood where all the pieces were. He had relationships on the board that had taken years to cultivate. He knew the company's financials at a level of granularity that almost nobody else had. He was the person you called when you needed something explained, when you needed something to actually happen, when you needed to understand where something had gone wrong. He had also, over the years, come to believe that the company would eventually be his. Not because he had been told this, because he had looked at the situation rationally and concluded that he was the logical outcome. Derek was the face. Richard was the substance. And when Arthur was gone, substance was what the company would need. He had also made certain private arrangements that he had not disclosed to anyone. We will come back to those. And then there was Eleanor. Eleanor left Pittsburgh at 22 for a graduate program in operations management at Ohio State. She was not the most celebrated student in her cohort. She did not give the speeches or lead the organizations. She sat in the front row and she asked questions that made her professors pause before answering. Not to be difficult, but because she had a way of identifying the gap between what a case study described and what the underlying numbers actually showed. She graduated in the middle of her class by every conventional measure. She graduated at the top of it by the measure that mattered to her, which was understanding the actual mechanics of how a business worked at the operational level. She went to work for a mid-sized freight logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. She started as an analyst. Within 3 years, she was running a department. Within 6 years, she was the director of the entire logistics division, a division that had been losing money when she arrived, and that was generating a consistent operating margin by the time she had finished restructuring it. She had cut costs. She had renegotiated vendor contracts. She had eliminated 3 layers of middle management that existed primarily to relay information that could have traveled directly. She had done it without announcing any of it, and the people she let go said later that she had been fair, that she had told them the truth about why, which was more than most people in her position ever did. Nobody in her family knew any of this in detail. At family dinners, she was still the youngest, still the one who had moved to Columbus and done something with logistics, still the one people asked about her personal life rather than her professional one. Patricia would ask, over dessert, whether she was seeing anyone. Derek would interrupt with something about the company. Eleanor would eat her food and answer what she was asked and not volunteer what she had not been asked. She had stopped being bothered by this a long time ago. She had understood, somewhere in her early 30s, that the invisibility was not a problem to be solved. It was information, and she had learned, from her father's Saturday morning sessions, to treat information carefully. Arthur called her home in January of 1998. He told her on the phone only that he wanted to see her, that it was important, and that she should plan to stay the weekend. She drove up from Columbus on a Friday evening. He was visibly diminished. She had not seen him since Christmas, and the change in 2 months was noticeable, in the way he moved, in the slight slurring at the edges of certain words, in the pauses that appeared in his speech where no pauses had been before. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. They had dinner together with Patricia, and they talked about nothing of consequence. And on Saturday morning, Arthur was in his study by 6, and he called her in after breakfast. He sat her down in the same chair she had sat in as a child, across the enormous desk, and he told her what he intended to do. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for almost a full minute. And then she told him he was wrong. She said, "They will fight it. Derek and Richard will spend years in court. The board will not accept an authority transfer under these circumstances. The company will be damaged by the fight regardless of who wins it. You should choose someone they will accept. Choose Richard. He is the most capable of the three of us, and you know that." Arthur looked at her for a long time. His expression did not change. And then he said, "I know all of that. I have been thinking about all of that for 3 years. And you are the only person who, when I told them what I was going to do, told me to choose someone else instead of saying yes. That is the answer I needed. Because a person who thinks about the company before themselves when they are being offered the company, that is the only person I would trust with it." She drove back to Columbus on Sunday evening. He spent the next 8 months working with 3 separate legal teams. He died in September of 1998. The will was read 4 days after the funeral, and everything changed in one sentence. The attorney who read the will was Gerald Marsh. He had been Arthur's primary legal counsel for 22 years. He had handled the contracts that built the company. He had advised on the acquisitions and the restructurings and the one near bankruptcy in 1979 that Arthur had pulled the company out of through a combination of ferocious cost discipline and 2 emergency bridge loans that Marsh had helped negotiate over a single weekend. He was not a man who showed emotion in professional settings. He said afterward, in a private conversation that became, through the usual channels of people telling other people what they were told in confidence, widely known, that he had never been in a room that changed temperatures so fast. The family sat at a round table in Marsh's conference room. Patricia at one position, Derek and his wife, Claire, to her right, Richard, alone, to her left, and Eleanor across from her mother, hands in her lap, expression unreadable. 2 board members had also been invited, at Arthur's specific instruction, not to participate, but to witness. Frank Haley was one of them. He sat against the wall rather than at the table, his face the face of a man who has done this kind of thing before and knows how to arrange his expression so it gives nothing away. Marsh read through the document in the measured, practiced tone of a man who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned that the way to do it was without dramatic pause and without softening language. The house went to Patricia. Financial provisions were made for Derek and Richard, substantial ones. Arthur had been generous. Charitable endowments were established, bequests to employees who had been with the company for more than 20 years. And then, near the end, for sentences that arrived in the same calm voice as everything before them. The controlling interest in Voss Industrial, 52% of all outstanding shares, is to be held in trust for my daughter, Eleanor Marie Voss, effective immediately upon my passing, with full voting and operational authority to be transferred to her within 30 days. Marsh set the document down. The room was silent for approximately 8 seconds. That does not sound like a long time. In that room, at that table, it was an extremely long time. Eleanor did not look at any of them. She looked at her hands in her lap. Derek stood up. He did not say anything. He walked to the door and out of it. His wife looked at Patricia and then followed him. By the time he reached the parking lot, he was already on his phone. He made 3 calls in the 12 minutes it took him to walk to his car and drive to the far end of the lot. 2 of those calls were to board members. One of them was to a family attorney who was not Gerald Marsh. Richard stayed at the table. He asked Marsh 3 precise questions about the trust structure and the transfer timeline. His voice was completely level. He wrote the answers on the back of an envelope he had in his jacket pocket. Then he thanked Marsh, picked up his coat from the back of the chair, and walked out. He did not look at Eleanor as he left. Patricia stayed. She sat very still for a moment after both her sons had gone. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on top of Eleanor's. Eleanor looked up. Patricia said, "Your father loved you very much." There was something in the way she said it that Eleanor would think about for a long time afterward. It was not entirely clear whether Patricia was saying this to comfort Eleanor or to explain to herself why Arthur had done what he had done. Perhaps both things were true at the same time. Eleanor nodded and said, "I know." And then she thanked Marsh and excused herself. The story leaked within 48 hours. It was never conclusively proven who had talked. The candidates were limited to the 12 people who had been present or directly informed, and none of them admitted it. But within 2 days, a reporter at a regional business publication had enough detail to run a piece under the headline, "Voss Industrial Succession, an Unexpected Choice." The story was carefully worded enough to avoid libel while being clear enough in its implication. Arthur Voss had, in his final months, made a decision that was being questioned by people close to the company. The phrase that appeared most often in subsequent coverage, In the industry blogs and the shareholder letters and the conversations at industry conferences that fall was the same word that had appeared in those parking lot phone calls: mistake. Arthur Voss had made a mistake. The evidence for this, in the minds of the people saying it, was straightforward. Eleanor Voss had no public corporate leadership record, no profile in the industry, no relationships on the board, no demonstrated ability to run something of this scale. The fact that she had spent 7 years quietly building a logistics operation in Ohio from a loss-making division into a profitable one was not information that those people had, because Eleanor had never made that information available. She had also never sought to make it available, which was itself information for anyone paying attention. Industry contacts called Frank Haley to express concern. Haley took those calls carefully, said careful things, and scheduled 3 dinners in the 2 weeks following the will reading, all with board members, all without notifying Eleanor. The dinners were described as routine. They were not routine. Haley had concluded, based on what he knew and what he was hearing, that Eleanor Voss was a transitional situation that needed to be managed, and that the board's role in the coming months was to ensure a smooth path to a more suitable long-term leadership arrangement. He told 2 board members, in separate conversations, that he gave her 18 months. Derek, in the meantime, had engaged a communications consultant. The consultant's mandate, from what could later be reconstructed from the invoices Eleanor found in the company's expense reports, was to build Derek's public profile as a credible industrial leader, someone the market, the press, and the board could see as a natural successor to Arthur Voss's legacy. Press interviews were arranged. An op-ed was placed in a regional business journal. The groundwork was being laid for a narrative. Eleanor was a temporary anomaly. Derek was the real heir, and the situation would correct itself. Richard's approach was different and, in Arthur's absence, more dangerous. Richard was not interested in public narratives. Richard had spent his career inside the machine, and he understood that the machine was what mattered. In the 3 weeks following the will reading, he quietly engaged 2 law firms, not the family's attorneys, different firms, to examine the trust structure that Arthur had used to execute the share transfer. His argument, when it was eventually formalized, was narrow and technical. The trust had procedural irregularities. Arthur's cognitive health at the time of signing was a legitimate question, and there were grounds to seek a delay in the transfer of authority pending a legal review. During the review period, an interim leadership structure would need to be in place. The interim structure Richard had in mind did not involve Eleanor. He did not file anything publicly. He was building carefully, making sure the argument was solid before he moved. He had given himself 6 weeks to have something he could actually use. Eleanor found out about the legal work on a Friday afternoon in November through a chain of communication that began with one of Richard's attorneys consulting a contact at Marsh's firm on a technical procedural question. The contact mentioned it to Marsh's associate. The associate told Marsh. Marsh called Eleanor that evening. She listened to what Marsh told her. She asked him 2 questions. She thanked him and said she would see him on Saturday. On Monday morning, she sent notices for a board meeting the following Thursday. It was not a defensive meeting. It was not a meeting about the legal challenge or about Richard or about the press coverage. Eleanor walked into that boardroom on Thursday morning and presented a 46-page operational assessment of Voss Industrial's current state. She had prepared it herself, she said when Haley asked. Without assistance, she said when he asked again. The document identified 3 underperforming divisions. It identified a redundant acquisition from 3 years prior that was generating losses which had been distributed across multiple budget lines in a manner that obscured the total. And it flagged a vendor services contract that had been renewed 18 months before Arthur's death on terms that were notably favorable to the vendor and notably unfavorable to Voss Industrial. She presented it without drama. She answered every question that was put to her. She did not point out, though she could have, that 2 of the items in the assessment were the direct responsibility of people in that room. She left the document with the board to review. She thanked them for their time. She went back to her office. The board met informally 3 days later, without Eleanor. The question on the table, initially, was whether she had prepared the document herself. The board member who had been in contact with Derek's office had a hard time believing it. 2 other board members had spent the intervening days going through the document in detail and had not found a single factual error. Richard's legal challenge collapsed 5 weeks after it was filed. Arthur's legal preparation had been exhaustive. The trust structure was airtight. The cognitive assessments were documented and certified. There was, in the end, nothing to challenge. The attorneys Richard had hired sent him a memo advising him to withdraw. He withdrew. He did not accept this as the end of it. He simply moved to a different board. And Eleanor, who had been working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, in her father's office since October, who had not yet spoken publicly, had not yet given an interview, had not yet attended a single industry event in her own name, went back to reading. There are two kinds of power in a company like Voss Industrial. There is the power that is written down in the articles of incorporation, in the shareholder agreements, in the title on the office door. And there is the power that accumulates in a room over time, the kind that lives in who people call when they need something, who they assume knows the answer, who's read of a situation other people defer to automatically, not because they have been told to, but because they have learned that this person is usually right. Eleanor had the first kind of power the day the transfer was completed. The second kind she would have to build. She understood this completely. She did not try to rush it. She did not call a company-wide meeting or give a vision speech or reorganize the senior leadership to signal that things were different now. She sat in her father's office and she read everything. Financial statements going back 12 years. Vendor contracts. Lease agreements. Insurance policies. Employment agreements for the top 40 positions in the company. The minutes of every board meeting from the past 8 years. Ruth Ellison, her father's assistant who had agreed to stay through the transition, said later that Eleanor had read more of the company's documentation in her first 6 weeks than most people in her position had read in their first 2 years. The first person Eleanor developed a real working relationship with was James Okafor. Okafor was the director of finance, a mid-level title that was a significant understatement of what he actually was. He had joined Voss Industrial 7 years earlier from a larger company and had spent those 7 years building a financial reporting system that was more rigorous and more granular than anything the company had had before. He understood the company's numbers at a level that few other people in the building did. He had also been, in the weeks following the will reading, conspicuously silent in the conversations that were happening around him. He had not attended the dinners that Haley had organized. He had not taken calls from Derek's communications consultant. He had gone to his office and done his job and waited. Eleanor came to him in her second week. She had a list of 12 questions about specific line items in the financial statements. He answered all 12. Then he asked her one question back. Had she seen the budget variance report from the second quarter? She said she had. She said the number on line 47 looked wrong to her. He said it was wrong. He said he had flagged it 6 months ago and had been told it was a rounding difference. She said, "Show me what the correct number should be." He showed her. She said, "And what does that tell us about the divisional report?" He said, "It tells us the division is underperforming by significantly more than the report shows." She said, "I need you to rebuild the full picture. Every division, every line, correct numbers. Not what was reported. What is true." He had it on her desk in 10 days. It was 61 pages. It was the document that became the foundation of the 46-page board assessment she presented 2 weeks later. She had condensed it, edited it, clarified it, and made sure that every finding could be supported by documentation she had reviewed herself. The board assessment accomplished several things at once. It demonstrated that Eleanor understood the company's finances at a granular level. It put documented problems on the record, problems that the board would now be responsible for addressing, which meant they needed her to address them. And it contained, buried in its final section, a reference to the vendor contract that Eleanor had flagged but not yet explained. That contract was what she was actually focused on. The vendor was a company called Meridian Facilities Group. It provided maintenance and facilities management services to 4 of Voss Industrial's manufacturing locations. The contract was 6 years old. It had been renewed 18 months before Arthur's death at a rate roughly 20% above comparable market benchmarks. Eleanor had noticed this in the first week when she was reading vendor agreements. She had put a small mark beside it in pencil. And then she had started asking questions about Meridian, quietly, through the normal channels of vendor review, without indicating that she was interested in anything other than routine contract management. Meridian was incorporated in Delaware, as many services companies are. Its registered agent was a law firm. Its ownership was not publicly listed. Eleanor engaged an outside forensic accounting firm. She told them she was conducting a vendor portfolio review. She asked them to identify the beneficial owners of Meridian Facilities Group. It took them 4 months. In the meantime, Derek's campaign was accelerating. He had given 3 interviews by spring. He had published 2 op-eds. The regional magazine profile had run, the one with the headline about him being the Voss who was ready, and it had been circulated in certain circles with the efficiency of something that had been quietly distributed. He was building a public version of himself, experienced, loyal to his father's legacy, committed to the company's long-term health. The implication was always present but never stated. Eleanor was a temporary condition. Derek was the destination. Some people believed this. Some board members were keeping their options open. 2 institutional shareholders had sent letters to Haley, not to Eleanor, asking questions about the company's long-term governance. Haley had responded in measured and careful language that left just enough ambiguity to be useful. Eleanor read every one of those letters. She had established, quietly, that all board correspondence was to be copied to her office. The board did not know she was reading them in real time. She was also building. In year 1, she made 3 personnel changes in the company. All 3 were voluntary departures she had negotiated privately. All 3 were positions that had been occupied by people who reported, through various structures, to Derek. She filled them with people who reported to Okafor. None of it was announced. None of it generated a press release. It happened through the normal administrative channels of a company making internal adjustments. In year 2, she made the decision about the aerospace acquisition. She had started looking at the aerospace components sector 14 months into her tenure. She had identified the specific company she wanted, a manufacturer in Ohio, well-run, undervalued, with technology that she had calculated would align with the direction she was already steering Voss Industrial's manufacturing capability. She had spent 8 months building the financial model, assessing the integration risk, and negotiating the purchase price down from $81 million to $64. She presented it to the board in the spring of year 2. The reaction was uniformly skeptical. The analysts downgraded the stock. The press was not kind. She had prepared for all of it. She had a 5-year integration model. She had a competitive analysis. She had documentation of exactly why the technology in that Ohio facility was worth what she was paying for it, and why it would be worth significantly more in 3 years. She did not argue with the skeptics. She completed the acquisition. She integrated the company. She put Okafor's team on the numbers. And she turned her attention back to Meridian. The forensic accounting firm delivered their findings in the 14th month of their engagement. The ownership chain ran through 4 holding companies, each in a different state. At the end of the chain was a private investment vehicle. The vehicle had 2 partners. One was a retired facilities executive. The other was Richard Voss. Richard held a beneficial interest in the vendor that held a 6-year contract with Voss Industrial. He had voted on the board to approve that contract's renewal. He had not disclosed his interest. He had been receiving quarterly distributions from the investment vehicle since the contract was first signed, 6 years before Arthur's death. Eleanor sat with this information for 8 months. She said nothing about it to anyone except Okafor, and only to Okafor because she needed him to verify the financial figures. She built a complete documentation package. Every holding company filing, every board meeting minute where Richard had been present and the contract had been discussed, every distribution record the accounting firm had been able to access. She waited for the annual governance review. It was a Thursday morning in October. The board sat at the long table in the full configuration, 10 members, plus Eleanor at the head. The regular agenda moved through in the usual order: financial review, divisional performance, governance matters. Frank Haley ran it, as he always did. At the end of the regular agenda, Eleanor said she had one additional item. She said it in the same tone she used for everything, measured, even, without theatrical announcement. She distributed a second document, face down, to each person at the table. She said, "Please turn to page 1. The document was 13 pages. It began with the vendor contract. It ended with Richard Voss's name, his interest in the holding structure, the board votes he had participated in, and the distributions he had received over 6 years. The room was very quiet. Frank Haley looked at the document. He looked at Eleanor. He looked back at the document. He turned to page 4. He turned back to page 2. He set the document down with the careful precision of a man who is making sure his hands are not shaking. He asked Eleanor whether outside counsel had reviewed the material. She said that outside counsel had prepared it with her, and that they were available to brief board members individually. The meeting adjourned without another agenda item being addressed. Frank Haley's resignation was delivered to Eleanor's office by courier at 7:40 the following morning. His personal items were removed from his office the following week. Richard's attorneys were contacted by Voss Industrial's legal team the same day the meeting adjourned. Richard settled 2 years later, quietly, without public admission. The settlement amount was not disclosed. The Meridian structure was dissolved. The contract was not renewed. Derek had already stopped giving interviews by then. The communications consultant had not been re-engaged for the second year. The magazine profiles had stopped arriving in people's inboxes. He was running a small private equity firm in Scottsdale, and he had gone quiet in the way of men who have lost something they cannot publicly mourn. But the real revelation, the thing Eleanor carried with her through all of it, was not about Richard or Frank or Derek. It was about her father. Among Arthur Voss's personal papers, which Eleanor had taken custody of after the estate settled and kept in a box in the credenza behind her desk, there was a letter. She found it on a Sunday afternoon, 14 months into her tenure. She was going through the box methodically. She had been working through it for several months, an hour here and an hour there on weekend afternoons when the office was quiet. Most of what was in the box she had already seen. Early contracts, correspondence with attorneys, industry newsletters from the 1970s that Arthur had kept for reasons she could only guess at, photographs from events she didn't recognize. The letter was in an envelope near the bottom of the box. Her name was on the outside in her father's handwriting. Not Eleanor, not Ellie, her full name, the way he had always addressed her when something was serious. It was handwritten on 4 sheets of cream notepaper, dated 2 years before his diagnosis, before he was sick, before he had started the legal work with the 3 firms. He had written it when he was healthy and when, as far as Eleanor knew at the time of reading, he had no particular reason to be writing her a letter of any kind. He did not begin with a greeting. He began the way he began everything, directly, in the middle of the thought. He wrote about what he had observed over 40 years of building something. He wrote about the men he had watched rise to positions of leadership in companies he had done business with and companies he had competed against and companies he had studied from the outside. He wrote about the pattern he had seen, over and over, that separated the ones who built things that lasted from the ones who built things that collapsed. It was not intelligence. He had known many intelligent people who built nothing that outlasted them. It was not charisma. He had watched charming men fail at the rate of any other man, usually faster, because they had come to rely on the charm doing work that the substance should have been doing. It was not even hard work. He had worked alongside people who worked longer hours than anyone he had ever met and who still, at the end of it, had nothing to show because the hours were not going into the right things. What he had observed, in the ones who built things that actually lasted, including himself, he said, with the self-awareness of a man who was not prone to false modesty, was a single quality, a way of being in a room. He wrote that the most expensive mistake he had ever seen in business was the assumption that a room agreed with you. That men rose to positions of authority and looked around at the meetings they chaired and the dinners they were invited to, and the board members who nodded when they spoke. And they concluded from all of this evidence that the room was on their side, that the consensus was real, that the agreement was genuine. And then something shifted, something always shifted, eventually, and they discovered that the room had never actually agreed with them. The room had simply been waiting. He wrote that he had watched his daughter, since she was 8 years old, never make that assumption. Not once. He wrote that she had always treated every room she entered as a room that might be against her, which meant she had always done the work before she arrived, which meant that when things shifted, when the room turned, as rooms always eventually turned, she was already positioned for it. She was never surprised. She had already read the document. She had already found the number that did not match. She had already prepared for the version of events where nobody was going to help her. He wrote, "You have never assumed a room agreed with you. That is the rarest thing I know. And it is the only thing, in 40 years of watching people try to build things, that I have seen actually hold." He wrote that he was giving her the company not because she was his daughter, though she was his daughter and he loved her in the precise, unexpressed way that had always been the only way he knew how to love anyone. He was giving it to her because he had spent 30 years watching her think, and he had seen something in the way she thought that he had not seen in anyone else, including himself at her age. And he was not willing to die, leaving it in the hands of people who had never earned the precision they displayed. That was the end of the letter. No closing, no signature. He had simply stopped writing when he had finished saying what he meant, the way he had always finished speaking when he had finished saying what he meant. Eleanor read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she folded it back along the original creases, slid it into the envelope, and placed it back in the box. She closed the credenza, and she went back to work. That letter was the only time Arthur Voss had ever told his daughter what he saw when he looked at her. And he had done it in a document she found on a Sunday afternoon 14 months after he was gone, alone in an office that used to be his, in a company that everyone had expected to watch her fail in. By the time she read it, she had already proven him right. She had just not known, until that moment, that he had known it first. 20 years. 20 years after Gerald Marsh sat at a round table in his conference room and read 4 sentences that nobody in that room was ready for, Voss Industrial has a market capitalization of $4.3 billion. It operates in 11 countries. It employs 14,000 people across manufacturing, industrial services, and aerospace components. The aerospace division that every analyst in the country called a mistake in year 2 now generates more revenue than the entire company did in the year Eleanor inherited it. It is not the same company Arthur Voss built. It is something Arthur built the foundation for and Eleanor built the rest of. That is not how the family would have described it in 1998. It is how the industry describes it now, without qualification or caveat. The people who laughed in 1998, where did they end up? Derek Voss runs a private equity firm in Scottsdale, Arizona. The firm is small. It manages capital from a handful of family offices and regional investors. He does not give interviews about manufacturing leadership anymore. He does not speak publicly about Voss Industrial. He plays golf. He attends his children's events. He has, by all observable measures, made a certain peace with the life he has. But people who know him say that he does not talk about his father much, that the subject, when it arises, is one he moves away from quickly, with the practiced ease of a man who has rehearsed the deflection many times. Richard Voss has not held a board position at any company in 15 years. He lives in a house in South Florida, bought before the settlement, which he is not required to sell. He is not destitute. The provisions Arthur made were genuine and substantial, but he is not building anything. He plays no role in any industry. He is mentioned occasionally in the footnotes of business school case studies about corporate governance failures. His name appears, in those footnotes, alongside the Meridian Facilities Group. He does not respond to interview requests. Frank Haley wrote a memoir about his career in industrial governance. It was published by a regional press. It sold modestly. In the memoir, he describes his years at Voss Industrial as a period of significant challenge and transformation. Eleanor Voss is mentioned once, in a sentence that describes the leadership transition as having, quote, exceeded the initial expectations of those involved in the governance of the company at the time. It is the most careful sentence in a careful book. It is the kind of sentence that tells you, without saying anything directly, exactly what the man who wrote it has had to come to terms with. Patricia Voss is still alive. She is 86. She lives in the Pittsburgh house she and Arthur shared for 34 years. She and Eleanor speak on the phone every Sunday evening. Patricia does not talk publicly about the will or about what happened in those first years. She has said, in the one interview she gave, about 5 years after the transfer, Arthur knew things that the rest of us didn't. He always did. That was just Arthur. James Okafor, the director of finance who was the only person in the building who took Eleanor seriously in the first 2 weeks, is now the chief operating officer of Voss Industrial. He has turned down 3 CEO offers from other companies in the past decade. He said in the one extended interview he has ever given that the decision to stay was not complicated. He said that working inside what Eleanor had built was more interesting than anything he could imagine building anywhere else, and that the opportunity to watch how she thought, up close, over 2 decades, was worth more than any title he had been offered. He was asked, in that interview, what the defining moment was. The moment he understood what Eleanor actually was. He said it was not the board assessment. It was not the aerospace acquisition, though that was when he knew for certain that she was going to succeed. It was earlier than either of those things. He said it was a board meeting in year 1. He said he watched her sit through 2 hours of that meeting, during which 3 separate board members interrupted her a total of 14 times. He had counted. He kept track on a notepad because after the 6th interruption it had started to feel like something he needed to document. She did not acknowledge a single one. She did not point it out. She did not adjust her tone, her pace, or her material in response to any of them. She simply waited each time for the interruption to finish and then continued from exactly where she had stopped, as if no time had passed, as if the interruption had not occurred. And she made sure that every time the floor was returned to her, what she said was the statement that ended the subject, the observation that could not be followed with another question, the number that settled the argument. She did it 14 times in 2 hours. Not once was she the loudest person in the room. Not once did she win by volume or force of personality. Every single time, she won by being right. He said, I stopped counting how many times she was underestimated around year 3. The count had gotten too high and the outcomes were more interesting to track. By year 3, the outcomes were extraordinary. Eleanor Voss does not give interviews. She has given 3 in 20 years, all of them focused on operational or sector topics, none of them personal, none of them reflective. She is not a public figure in the way her brothers once tried to be. She does not appear on lists of most powerful executives, not because she is not eligible for them, but because she does not participate in the nominations process and has declined, on multiple occasions, to sit for the profile interviews that would make her eligible. She runs a company. She runs it very well. She has been running it for 20 years. That appears to be sufficient for her. There is a photograph from 2018, taken at the company's 20th anniversary event, which was held in the atrium of the headquarters building that Eleanor had rebuilt and expanded in year 7. Several hundred employees are gathered in the frame. Eleanor is standing at a podium. She is speaking, and she is smiling in a way that none of the photographs of her from 1998 had ever shown. Not the broad, camera-ready expression of a corporate event. A private smile. The expression of someone who is thinking about something that the people in the room do not have access to. The expression of a person who knows exactly how the story ends, because she is the one who wrote it. Arthur Voss made a decision in 1998 that the people around him called a mistake, a sentimental error, evidence of a mind in decline. They said he had lost the clarity that had built the company. They said he had let love override judgment, which was the one mistake he had always refused to make. They said the thing he had spent 40 years building was now in the hands of someone who would watch it come apart. Arthur Voss had spent 40 years being right about things that other people laughed at. He understood something about his daughter that she maybe did not fully understand about herself until she was a decade into proving it. He understood that precision outlasts performance, that patience outlasts noise, that the person who never assumes the room agrees with them is, in the end, the person the room cannot move. He wrote it down for her. He left it in a box. He trusted that she would find it. And when she did find it, alone on a Sunday afternoon in an office that used to be his, she had already done everything he had hoped she would do. She had not needed the letter to do it. She had never needed anyone to tell her what she was. But she needed to know that he had known it first. Pause. Did Arthur Voss make the right call? Or did a precise man, at the end of his life, simply trust the most precise thing he had ever seen and get out of the way? Tell me what you think. Drop it in the comments. If you have stayed with me through all of that, then you already know why I make these stories. Because the most interesting things that happen in this world do not make the front page. They do not happen in courtrooms with cameras or press conferences with prepared statements. They happen in boardrooms, in law offices, in the quiet space between people who thought they knew each other and then found out, slowly and then all at once, that they did not. They happen in a Saturday morning office, when a man looks up from his desk and asks his youngest child what she thinks, and she tells him the truth. They happen in a Sunday afternoon 4 months into a job that everyone said she would fail at, when a woman opens a file she has already read 3 times and finds the thing that changes everything. They happen in a letter that a dying man writes to his daughter 2 years before he gets sick, because he already knows what he is going to do, and he needs her to understand why, even if she will not read it until after he is gone. I want to know what you think about this one. Did Arthur Voss make the right call? Was Eleanor Voss the outcome of who she was? Was she always going to be this, regardless of whether her father chose her? Or did being put in that position make her into something she could not have become any other way? And is there someone in your life that you have been underestimating? Someone who is sitting in the corner, reading documents nobody asked them to read, saying almost nothing, waiting? Drop it in the comments. Be honest. I will be reading all of them. If you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. This is what we do here. Every single week. Real stories. Real stakes. No inflation, no sensationalism. Just the story, told the way it deserves to be told. Hit the button. You know where it is. That one is going to stay with you. I will see you there.